Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents #Church2, How Purity Culture Upholds Abuse and How to Find Healing, by Emily Joy Allison. Narrated by Emily Ellet. Forward. On November 21, 2017, I was finishing a residency at St. John's University in Minnesota. I had gone there to finish my first book. By the time I left, I'd had my last Thanksgiving with my in-laws. Then I moved out of my home and ended my 12-year marriage. But before all of that, I spent time going to Mass, writing, and walking through the snowy woods, trying not to pray to a God I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. During the evenings, I'd go into Vespers and sit alone in the church, watching the monks, the men, go through their rituals, which seemed both so new and ancient to me since I'd been raised evangelical. I thought, these men cannot get me here. I am safe here. My marriage was ending, and the world was falling down around me. The #MeToo movement had begun that October and was picking up steam. Every morning I'd read the news. Another bad man outed. Another woman's shame on display. Another woman's strength asserted. I, too, carried stories in my body. A boss who'd harassed me at a literary conference. My sister's abuser who was a relative. And for me, a dorm room, 2 men, beer, and a memory that haunted me for years until 2017, when, while watching Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation hearing, I understood that it hadn't been my fault. But on November 21, 2017, all of that was swirling through the air like the snow at St. John's, both making it so hard to breathe. That day, checking Twitter after a day of writing, I saw the #Church2. I clicked immediately and read and read. Each story pulled me down and down until I was submerged in a world of stories that were both foreign and familiar. They weren't my stories, but they were my stories. I had been raised evangelical and homeschooled in Texas in the 1990s. There I was raised with the doctrine of baptism by full immersion. Only then would we be fully purified. Reading the #Church2 thread was an immersion of another kind, a baptism in a world of truth. Months before, in couples therapy, where I was frantically trying to hold together the fraying ends of my marriage, the therapist had told my husband and me that I'd been spiritually abused. Spiritual abuse is when the Bible is used to control and restrain a person, she'd explained. My husband was confused. "Isn't that what religion is?" he'd asked. She tried to explain. He didn't understand. We'd gotten married at 22, both of us pure until marriage. Well, pure-ish for me. There was still that night in the dorm room, which had happened when I was dating him, and I'd convinced myself it never happened. I'd pushed it from my mind, and it would only return when I'd smell Bud Light or the Clearasil face wash I'd used to clean my whole body in the shower the morning after. Years later, I'd read about a 2013 study where 0.5% of women surveyed reported getting pregnant before they'd had sex. These women were more likely to have signed a chastity pledge and more likely to have had parents who'd had trouble discussing sex and birth control. The study's authors were confused and thought that it was a statistical anomaly, that maybe the women had forgotten. But to me, it made perfect sense. I'd been raised in the purity culture of the 1990s. I'd been given a ring at 16. I'd been told that no man would want me if I was ruined, used, like a dirty tissue, as one Sunday school teacher had demonstrated. "You were the tissue. No one wants a used tissue." Raised to believe my body was my primary value in a marriage, I'd done everything I could to stay pure. Except one night, where there was drinking, and I'd said no, but it happened anyway, and now everything I'd tried to be was lost. I refused to let that happen. It was a conscious decision to try to forget. I could only live through denial. If I would have been able to talk about what happened, if I would have had the language of consent, the language of boundaries and healthy sexuality, I would have been able to forge for myself a path of autonomy, one where my value wasn't my body. When I had that language, when I finally was able to say, I am worth more, it ended my marriage. And during that divorce, my ex tried to argue that I owed him $10,000 for his investment in my brain. That's all I was, a body. My lawyer and I laughed at that line item, which we fought against and won. But it still stands there in the spreadsheet, an accounting of my worth as a human. Brain, $10,000. Vagina? When I left my marriage, I found a new therapist and told her about spiritual abuse. And she said, "Oh, that's just abuse. And that therapist was right, and that therapist was also wrong. The intersection of religion and sexual abuse is pervasive and insidious. As Emily Joy Allison lays out in this book, even for those not raised in conservative evangelical faith traditions, the myths of purity culture are steeped into American society. Allison lays it out with the precision of a doctor cutting out a cancer. Thanks to Bush-era politics, abstinence-only education is pervasive in schools across America. The narrative that pits fetus against human mother is one that our culture buys writ large, when in reality it's as ridiculous a premise as debating flat earth versus round. Sexual abuse, when wrapped in the sugar-coating of religion, is a particularly toxic and American poison. It infects our society, from our state-level policies on Planned Parenthood funding, to Medicaid dollars, to school sex ed, to the availability of birth control, and Supreme Court decisions on whether birth control should be covered by employers. And in this country are powerful pockets of control. Churches, unscrutinized locales of religious and patriarchal law. If religious myths about purity and bodies are the toxins that float through our culture, poisoning our air, Emily Joy Allison's book is the antidote. A graduate of Moody Bible Institute, Allison is a Samson, breaking down the walls of an unholy temple from the inside. She writes with the understanding of someone who was raised in the prison of purity culture, but from the perspective of someone who is freed. Her perspective opens the prison door, offering an escape for people who are trapped, but also inviting others in to understand an influential aspect of American culture. #Church2 is an invitation to honesty. It's a baptism in truth. It's a holy reckoning. As I read it, I thought of Luke chapter 12, verses 2-3, which speaks of the holy justice, warning, "Nothing is covered up that will not be uncovered, and nothing secret that will not become known. Therefore, whatever you have said in the dark will be heard in the light, and what you have whispered behind closed doors will be proclaimed from the housetops." Allison is this light. But as much as it is a condemnation, it is also an invitation to something better. Allison's work does dredge up the muck of religion, but she also offers a better way. The Gospel of 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9 declares that God has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Whatever else this book is, it is an invitation into a marvelous light, into a world where sex is not shamed but affirmed, where gender identities are not mistakes or sins, but crucial aspects of our glorious selves. Part memoir and part manual, this book is both scalpel and bandage. It slices through the disease, but also offers healing. It's the book I want to give to every pastor who refused to talk to me without my husband present, to the camp counselor who said women were like wild horses who needed to be tamed into submission, to the friends who advised my family to forgive my sister's abuser because, after all, hadn't God forgiven King David of that one sin? This is also the book I wish I could have given to myself at 18. A manual unraveling all the things I had been told that were wrong, the things that would keep me tied up and wrapped up until, at 33, I finally got free. Not because I was so enlightened, but because I was so broken. In the aftermath of 2017, I'd often heard arguments that #MeToo had gone too far, but I never believed it. I didn't believe it because I knew too many stories that still lay in the secret parts of so many bodies. I didn't believe it because I knew that the double layers of patriarchy and religion had yet to be fully reckoned with. I remembered the youth pastor at the megachurch in Eden Prairie, Minnesota, who disappeared one day amid rumors he'd slept with underage students. Slept with, as if a 35-year-old pastor and a 17-year-old could ever have a fully consensual relationship. I remember that story so often, because, at the time, my sister was being assaulted. I wouldn't know until later, until I was in college, what had been happening, but I don't think the two are unrelated. When abuse is treated with silence and shame, we learn to handle it with silence and shame. When respectable men sweep crimes under the prayer rug of our churches, what they teach us is that our bodies don't matter. But they do matter. And #MeToo will have gone far enough when it cleans out every aspect of shame in our society. What Allison is doing in this book is an act of grace, a holy gift to those of us broken, to those of us in shame, to those of us lost in a world that doesn't value our bodies, that turns victims into villains. This book is calling us forth from the darkness into a light, and I hope you listen to it, and I hope you get free. Liz Lenz, author of Godland, A Story of Faith, Loss, and Renewal in Middle America, and Belabored, A Vindication of the Rights of Pregnant Women. Introduction. Our bodies hold our stories. Long after the memories have become like a faded dream to our minds and hearts, our bodies remember. My body felt like it was being forcibly shoved down memory lane on November 21, 2017, as I sat silently at my kitchen table, reading the news and cupping an oversized glass of rosé between both hands to keep them from shaking. Names and faces of male celebrities whose movies I hadn't been allowed to watch growing up as a homeschooled pastor's daughter flashed across my laptop screen. And even though I didn't know these men, reading the allegations against them suddenly made me feel like I was 16 again. I felt panicked, vulnerable, and so angry. Without stopping to think too hard about my feelings, I grabbed my phone and sent a frantic group text to several friends. "Should I out my abuser on Twitter?" I wrote. "Probably, huh?" I didn't consciously know why that exact moment seemed like the right time to share a story with the entire internet that I usually reserved for close friends and therapists. I wasn't thinking about the fact that it had been 10 years, almost to the day, since the only world I knew fell apart. November 12, 2007, just 9 days before. But my body knew, and my body was ready for everyone else to know too. Supportive texts from my friends started trickling in, and I decided to do this thing before I lost the sudden burst of courage. I took a deep breath, stood up, poured myself another glass of rosé, sat back down, and started typing. "Hey, so this is me being brave. This is me being brave as a result of so many women in the world being brave right now. This is me standing on your shoulders. I'm so thankful for all of you." I was through the second glass before I'd finished sharing my story in one long thread, tweet by tweet. Details. names. Of my abuser, of the church where he found me, dates and places. I relived months of trauma in under an hour, feeling like I was watching my life in fast forward. When I sent the final tweet, I stood up shakily, gripping the edge of the kitchen table for support and letting my head fall between my shoulders. Now what? When I was abused as a teen, I didn't know it. Most of the adults in my life didn't know it either. It took years to be able to look at the trauma I had experienced and attach the word abuse to it, something I was only able to do after talking to a therapist in college, who told me she could not believe I hadn't been sexually assaulted because I was presenting all the same behaviors and thought patterns as someone who had been. I didn't realize at the time that what was happening to me was abusive because it had been modeled to me as the ultimate fairy tale romance my entire life. Growing up, my parents regaled my siblings and me with retellings of their love story, how they fell in love when my father was a Southern Baptist youth pastor in a small-town church, and my mother was a teen in his youth group. It was okay, though, they told us, because my father was sure to ask permission from the head pastor of the church, as well as my mother's parents, both of whom gave their blessing for him to date my mother, who was 7 years his junior. They married just a few days after her high school graduation. I was born 3 years later, the first of 7 children. This was love, they told us. And if we wanted love like that, it was important that we followed all God's rules for love. God had a lot of rules, as it turns out. My parents kept us in the dark about sex as long as they possibly could. But when it became clear that a feature of our participation in junior high youth group at the non-denominational evangelical megachurch we had started attending would be the occasional talk from the youth pastor, they realized they couldn't wait much longer. The summer before I started 6th grade, my parents sat me down awkwardly in a hotel hot tub on a family road trip. A move that I think they ended up regretting, as the sex talk in my family came to be known euphemistically as the hot tub talk forevermore after that, and explained the bare-bones mechanics of biological procreation, then spent the rest of the conversation stressing in no uncertain terms that you weren't to do that or anything like it until you were married to a man, because God says so. That made sense enough to my 12-year-old self, who had just recently developed a first crush. But about a year later, my parents informed me that we'd be taking a special weekend trip, just the 3 of us, to talk about some more important things. When the weekend finally came, my mother took me shopping at the mall, loading my arms up with bags and bags of trendy new school clothes. Then we went out to dinner and met up with my father. And when we got in the car, they started playing some cassette tapes from a series by Dr. James Dobson of Focus on the Family. The series was about insecurity, peer pressure, relationships, and other issues young people face as they grow up. At one point, Dr. Dobson started talking about masturbation. I had only heard that word once or twice and had no idea what it meant, but they quickly fast-forwarded through that bit. By the time we reached our destination, a retreat property owned by a family friend, they were ready to educate me on exactly how much God expected of me when it came to sex. They refreshed my memory about the talk we'd had the previous year in the hot tub. I was reminded that, obviously, God forbids me from having sex before I get married. And then my father asked me about dating. "How long," he asked, "do you think you should wait to kiss a boy if you're dating?" I was too naive to realize it was a trick question, so I thought about it as genuinely as I could and gave it my best shot. I don't know, a few weeks, a few months? At 13, I could barely muster up the courage to speak to the boy I had a crush on, so kissing anybody was such an abstract idea. My father laughed out loud as if he couldn't contain himself, and then sobered up quickly. "Oh, no, he said. "We've got to talk." They proceeded to explain to me how, when you kiss or cuddle or hold hands with a boy, or even touch him at all, he can get turned on. And if you turn on a boy but you don't intend to have sex with him because you're not married, then you're basically lying to him and telling his body that you can have sex even though you can't. Defrauding him, they called it. They explained that this isn't God's plan, and that God wants all his followers to remain completely and totally pure until marriage, and that girls should never turn a boy on. There was no discussion of whether girls could also be turned on. So in order to accomplish this, they said, the best plan was to never touch a boy whom you're dating. That's how you knew it was a good, godly relationship. Once you got engaged to be married, it was safe to hold hands, but you definitely couldn't kiss or do anything more than kiss until you got married. I was a little confused. I didn't think kissing was a sin. I asked if it was, and they explained that even though it wasn't technically a sin, you couldn't do it without causing the boy to sin, so you had to treat it like a sin and stay far away. I closed my eyes and silently filed kissing away in my brain in the same category as drinking alcohol. Not technically a sin, but so close to a sin that it might as well be a sin. Okay. At that moment, they produced a beautiful white gold ring with an amethyst center stone, my birthstone. It was tucked inside a little black jewelry box and was the prettiest thing I'd ever seen. Purple was my favorite color. They said they wanted to give it to me as a symbol of my purity, but they could only give it to me if I absolutely promised not to hold hands with a boy until I was engaged to be married to him, and not to kiss or have sex until after I was married. If that was what it took to please God, I was down. If it pleased my parents at the same time, all the better. Hell, those two things were basically the same as far as I was concerned, and my parents never tried to untangle their dictates from God's. I wasn't sure how I felt about my sexual boundaries, but I figured it didn't matter how I felt because I had clearly been super wrong about the whole kissing thing. What did I know? I said yes. They gave me the ring. I put it on, and I proceeded to take my promise and the strings attached to it extremely seriously in the coming years. And that was my sex education. They say that you can boil a live frog in an open pot of water if you turn the heat up just a little bit at a time. This fact is usually used by preachers as a sermon illustration about the dangers of compromising your morals and sliding down the slippery slope. But the irony is that it's also a popular tactic abusive men of God use to ensnare their victims. My own boiling began in high school. My abuser operated under most people's radars at the aforementioned non-denominational evangelical megachurch my family attended. He was a quiet and unassuming man in his late 20s when I met him in the high school youth group when I was 14. A photographer and website designer by trade, he was extremely tech-savvy, so when he volunteered as a leader for the youth group, they put him to work operating PowerPoint presentations on the computer, taking pictures, and creating the youth group newsletter. A group of us students who were interested in technology coalesced around him, and he taught us the basics of Adobe Suite products, photography, and other cool things we didn't have the opportunity to learn elsewhere. He started singling me out early, paying me compliments, giving me more responsibilities than the other students, and even going so far as to pay me for doing non-church work for him, such as proofreading copy for websites he'd been contracted to build. Conversations slowly drifted from how to set up layers in InDesign to who I was dating, and I became accustomed, as many of the students did, to discussing the intimate details of my romantic life, what little there was, with him. He styled himself as a mentor and gave advice in a way that implied you'd be awfully foolish to do otherwise. In what I now recognize to be classic predatory grooming behavior, he even convinced me to break up with the person I was dating at 15. He told me it was because this boy wasn't godly enough, and if I really loved God, I wouldn't want to be with someone who didn't love God just as much. At the start of my junior year of high school, I was single once again, with my prized kiss-ginity still intact. A new boy had come to our youth group that year and began trying to get me to go out with him. Advances I initially dodged, but as time went on and he persisted, I began to wonder if maybe I shouldn't give him a shot. After all, he was so nice. In October, I was sitting at a high-top table in the youth group room with my abuser, contemplating my next move, when I asked him, "What would you think if I dated Mark?" I remember his face twisting up, brow furrowing in what I interpreted in the moment to be genuine uncertainty, but that was actually calculated, intentional, and well-planned in advance. Game. He blinked his eyes open and looked back up to make eye contact with me, the last moment before everything changed. Set. I'd be heartbroken. Match. My world spun. My abuser was in his 30s by this time. I managed to quietly eke out, "You're old enough to be my father." Apparently not quietly enough. He shushed me. I had to go home. I grabbed my younger brother from the other room and jumped in our family's 15-passenger van I'd driven there, gripping the cold plastic steering wheel with white knuckles the entire drive back to our house. Had he really said what I thought he'd said? Had he meant what I thought he'd meant by it? I got into bed as soon as I walked in the door and went to sleep, still trying to figure out if the whole night had been one weird fever dream. In an ideal world, I would have immediately told my parents, my youth pastor, or another trusted adult what had happened. In an ideal world, I would have known that I needed to, and the adults in my life would have known immediately that I was the victim of predatory behavior. But it was so confusing. My abuser was a trusted adult. My parents had him over for dinner regularly and knew and liked him. My dad had been my mom's youth pastor, after all, and my abuser hadn't kissed me or even tried to hold my hand, so it couldn't possibly be sinful. And anyway, I was 16 years old. That was old enough for a romantic relationship with a man, wasn't it? I don't even know if I had heard the word consent spoken aloud ever, let alone knew what it meant, or that it was negated by one party being a minor and the other party being a spiritual authority figure. Sex was as abstract to me then as kissing had been at 13. I didn't really know how it worked in practice or what my own body parts were called. I certainly didn't know that a romantic relationship between a teenage girl and an adult mentor in a religious setting was illegal in several states and unethical in all of them. I trusted him explicitly. He was a godly man who had my best interests at heart. He had told me that so many times. I spent the next couple days stewing silently over what had happened. At that point, my abuser had normalized talking to me for hours every day, even when we weren't at church. He always chatted with me through Gmail throughout the day, sending me messages to read later when I wasn't online. But after that, there were no more chats, no more emails. Radio silence for days. Finally, a few days later, an email arrived. Something about silence not being so golden. Something about how he was sorry if he offended me. Something about how he really thought it would be a God-honoring relationship. A God-honoring relationship. A God-honoring relationship? I didn't know about that. But once I thought about it, I realized I had never known what honored God in a relationship. I thought it would be God-honoring to kiss after a few months of dating, but my parents told me that wasn't true. I thought my relationship with my boyfriend the year before had been God-honoring, but my abuser told me that it wasn't. Every time I thought I was on the right track, An authority figure had stepped in to show me that I wasn't pleasing God as much as I thought I was. And I really, really cared about pleasing God, more than I cared about anything. I couldn't stop thinking about how my mother was about my...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?